going back at least 10 years for this one. But it's something I still think about almost every dang day. It was the holiday season, incredibly cold out. And I was walking down the 40th Street Lowry Street subway station near Queens Boulevard. I can't remember exactly where I was going at the time. I think I was on my way home from work. But I'm not sure if I actually worked a shift or if I just stopped by to pick up in advance. But either way, I'm basically in a world of my own, mulling over my financial troubles as I push through the ticket barrier and find a place to sit. Then some person gets my attention. But only in that New York way where you don't ever look directly at the thing, you just observe carefully, out of your peripheral vision. This young-looking Latina lady wearing a blue, white, and gray jacket was pacing up and down the platform and like muttering to herself. It sounds cynical, I know. But when you grow up, and then YC, you learn to live with stuff like that. He learned to just shrug it off and say it's none of my business, before moving on. But sometimes you don't get to just look away and pretend it isn't happening. Because that craziness, those damaged people, they make it your business. So like I said, the Hispanic girl is walking up and down, occasionally sitting down and then getting up again, all her radically, and all the while, all the other passengers are just pretending like it's not happening. Then we hear the telltale sign of a train coming down the tunnel. So just like usual, all the people taking it gradually stand up and make their way towards the edge of the platform. I remember seeing this one dude. He was some older-looking guy. And he's just minding his own business, waiting for the train to roll up. Then out of nowhere, the girl basically runs up behind the guy and shoves him onto the tracks. The sound the crowd made is something that will definitely stick with me for the rest of my life. You don't forget real terror like that when you hear it. But the messed up thing is, although they were screaming, no one actually did anything to help. I even remember seeing this flashing light and realizing that some dude was literally just standing there taking pictures of the guy lying on the tracks as the train got louder and louder, and it got closer and closer. And then, as the screams reached this unbearable peak of horror, the train just rolled over the dude. I remember looking around and seeing the girl that had pushed him bolting up the stairs, trying to get as far away from the scene as she could. People were still screaming. Only now some were crying while others followed the pusher up the stairs to either chase her or rushing the payphones to call 911. It all happened so fast. I realized that all I'd done is just stand there open mouth, just horrified by the whole thing. And for the longest time I've kicked myself for not trying to help the guy, but more than one person has informed me that if I had jumped down to try to help the dude, I probably wouldn't be around right this. I know the pusher was caught as I follow the story for a while after, but I can't remember if they were charged with murder or just ended up getting locked up in Bellevue or something. Because as sure as eggs, that girl was bats. Taking the subway got real stressful for a long time after, but thankfully, a lot of people were just as scared as I was. And I didn't have to suffer through the anxiety of watching people go too near the edge. They made sure not to all their own. Time went by, and hysteria about subway pushers kind of faded. But every so often that still happens. In fact, that happened again just last month. Again, it was a woman from Queens that was arrested. Apparently, she never spoke to the guy she pushed, just picked someone at random and almost killed the guy. Hearing about other pushers just brings all that fear right back to me. One minute you're standing there minding your own business just waiting for the frickin' subway, and the next, there's nothing life can end that suddenly because some psycho decided you had to die. Some psycho you never met before in your life. The fact that people out there exist. There are a lot of them. That's the thing that scares me the most in the world, and why I never get up for a train before it comes to a complete stop. I used to work the stand-up circuit in Boston. And let me tell you, that was a wild time to be a comedian. And when you were like me and chose to get the tea everywhere, it was even wilder. For those of you that don't know, the T is just what we call the subway and being town. And although it might not have the same nationally terrible reputation as New York subway, I can assure you, it used to be just as tough. Now, this happened way back when phones were just starting to get video recording technology and being something of a gadget freak. I paid out the butt to be one of the first to own one. So one night, I'm coming back from a show just playing with my new phone when some girl gets out of the train and sits down opposite me. We make this tiny bit of eye contact, nothing confrontational. And as the train gets moving again, I carry on wasting time with my new toy. I'm going through some photos I'd taken at a show I'd done recently. And I remember I was smiling in a real good mood when I suddenly hear, "Are you recording me?" I look her up and it's the girl. Some ratchet South Boston girl who looked like she hadn't slept in a year. She's got this look on her face that looked like a Rottweiler chewing a wasp. And when I'm like, "Who you?" she screeches, "Yeah, me, you better not be recording me with that thing." I couldn't resist. I was like, "Why would I make a video you? I leave prettier things in the toilet every morning." Not the smartest move, to just antagonize her like that. But hey, it's what I do for a living. And I was very much still in work mode. The retort seemed to do the trick for a minute, and the girl shut her mouth for a while and left me in peace. And then a minute later, she starts up again. "Oh, you think you're wicked? Smart, huh? You think you're hot stuff." I was only 2 stops away from home. So I decided to toy with her a little, nothing too harsh, just enough to pass the time until I could get off. Then read as I'm getting off, I actually wish her a good night. I'd actually enjoyed our little back and forth. Whereas she still looked incredibly mad. I didn't think she'd do what she did, though. I know she was mean, but I didn't think she was crazy. So I'm standing waiting for the doors to open. And when they do, I instantly feel this real sharp pain right around my butt. I instantly kind of throw myself off the train while spinning around to see what in God's name just happened. There's Ratchet, this big smile on her face. And she's holding a needle in her hand. Jesus Christ. That girl had real summer teeth, you know, summer here summer. They're all the hallmarks of a hardcore junkie. And as the doors started to close behind us, she just started laughing. Turns out she'd gotten the good few times in the butt cheek with that neither one. Although it only hurt a little for the next few days. My big fear was that I've gotten some kind of junkie disease like Hep C or HIV or something. It's kind of a war story I tell these days, but just typing it up like this reminds me of how scared I was. I went straight to the hospital without checked out. But after taking some blood samples, they told me I'd have to wait a few days to find out the results. Longest days of my life. I took those days off because there was no way I could still be funny with all of that on my mind. But thankfully, it all came back clean. It didn't hurt to sit down for a few days. But other than that, I'd be fine. Actually turned the whole thing into a stand a bit a few years later. And I suppose that's just my way of dealing with things. But even though I can tell the story these days with a smile on my face, and in a way that can make people at least giggle a little bit, that doesn't change the fact that it was one of the scariest things that ever happened to me. At the time, I thought my smart mouth almost cost me my life. And one of the most nightmarish ways to die imaginable. I grew up an avid aerobics enthusiast here in New York City. As you can imagine, there are awesome sites here, but weirdly, I'd say more than 50% of the community agree that one of the urbex holy grails is over in Cincinnati. Yep. While Cincinnati is famous for that weird Greek chili or their OG baseball team, among the urbex crowd, it's famous for one thing, the Cincinnati subway. For those of you that don't know, the subway was intended as a replacement for the Cincinnati streetcar system. Construction started around the end of World War I. But then after the Great Depression hit, the project just tanked. What remains is just over 2 miles of derelict tunnels and stations, making it the largest abandoned subway system in the United States. Cracking the place is like an urbex rite of passage, giving you infinite bragging rights having explored a labyrinth of subterranean tunnels that's larger than some towns. I thought my visit to the subway would be a dream come true. Me and my group planted for months, and I don't think I've ever been so excited about anything. But in reality, it turned out to be one of the most confusing and terrifying experiences of my life, something I'll never be able to fully explain. As I said, it took quite a bit of planning to get the four of us out to southwestern Ohio. On top of barely being able to afford the gas money, we had to drive my friend's trashy 1990 Chevy Lumina, which was in such a bad way that it had become a meme of itself. It took almost 12 hours to get to Cincinnati. That's including a bathroom break. So even after leaving at like 9 a.m., the very earliest we could muster everyone, it was way after dark by the time we arrived. We were tired, starving, and in no mood to head underground right away. So after a brief discussion, we decided to get a few hours sleep before heading down into the subway. This turned out to be a terrible idea. We barely got any sleep. So after a few hours, we decided to just get some breakfast at 24/7 McDonald's, then hit up the subway while we couldn't still use the darkness for cover. The entrance to the tunnels, at least the one we used, turned out to be right in plain sight. It was just sat at the side of the highway clear as day, and although the big gray iron doors were incredibly heavy, they proved to be unlocked. And just like that, we were in. Then one of them switched on their flashlight, and for a second, I was kind of taken aback. The concrete walls inside the entrance were completely bare. Now the single tag or piece of graffiti art anywhere. One of the best parts of urbex is occasionally stumbling across what amounts to a secret gallery. So they come across a place with no art where I expected a most was kind of disappointing. It didn't set alarm bells ringing or whatever, it was just unusual. Anyway, we excitedly started dancing down the entrance tunnel and find that it branched off and the two twin tunnels that ran side by side. Then after a few minutes of walking, the tunnels opened up into our first abandoned station. You can imagine what this looked like: wide platforms with support columns, staircases that lead to nowhere. It was a pretty cool find, and it was there that we found our first piece of street art only, instead of being something to admire. I remember finding it distinctly intimidating. Someone had sprayed a huge black figure onto the whole length of one wall, with its head and shoulders kind of overflowing onto the ceiling. The perspective made it look like it was staring down at you, and it definitely made for an intelligent and decidedly creepy piece of artwork. The logistics of it were downright impressive too. The walls had to be at least 15 foot high at the platform level, meaning someone had probably hauled a ladder down there with him at some point, just to spray that blank-faced Yeti-looking thing on the wall. After we were suitably unnerved by the big dark figure, we carried on through the rail tunnels, hitting up station after station as we went. Each one had a series of smaller tunnels leading off from them. Some were just a handful of dead ends. Others seemed to sneak off into the darkness for quite a way. But the last station we got to, or at least that I got to, had a ton of different passages leading off from it. I'm guessing we were around the center of the subway system by that point, because I read that they planned to dig out the central terminal station first, then tunnel outwards so everything fit to scale. And given that there seemed to be a tunnel, passageway, or corridor at every compass point, I'm guessing we were in that terminal station. And despite the creepy street art, we're getting pretty comfortable by that point. The first 10 to 15 minutes after you crack an old abandoned building can be a real adrenaline rush. And if there are hazards to be aware of, your heart stays pounding almost the whole way through. By that time, our count was in the high 50s, and I go so far as to say that we were pretty experienced. But then experience brings comfort, and getting too comfortable makes you sloppy. Add on to that bad night's sleep and the sugar crash from having gorged under the golden arches. And for me personally, it was a recipe for disaster. It's not a strict life or death rule. But generally speaking, you don't split up when exploring an abandoned building. Sure, you can head off into an adjacent room, dip slightly out of sight for a second, but you don't go off wandering on your own. Nonetheless, you're very, very confident of your surroundings. You hear horror stories about gas sinks where someone walks into a room and just passes out and dies, all totally silently, then one by one, their friends follow them into the room, only to join them in death. Little tidbits like that serve as great warnings. But gas sinks are an extremely rare phenomenon that you only get when you're really deep underground. So despite the potential for danger, I think I just switched off a few seconds and wandered down a passageway on my own. It was dumb, I know. But I swear I didn't walk too far. And I remember the feeling of confusion when I turned around and walked back down the corridor, only to find that it didn't open back up into the abandoned station. I stopped and paused for a second, feeling this momentary sense of bewilderment wash over me before I took a deep breath and gathered my thoughts. My crew had to be at the end of the corridor I was looking at, it was only logical. But when I walked down it, still using my flashlight to cut through the darkness. And there was still no station. I'll admit that. I started to panic a little. My voice echoes as I call it out down the corridor, hoping my friends might be able to hear me. When they didn't respond, I did what anyone else might do. This went straight into denial. I call it out sarcastically. "Very funny, guys, you can come out now." But no one replied. Then I tried to stop myself from walking down another corridor. But in that brief little moment of panic, I just couldn't help myself. It didn't make sense. I knew how to follow my own footsteps. I'd done it 1,000 times before. But there I was, 50-something derps under my belt, and I'd actually gone and gotten myself lost. I just put it down to how tired I was and how dark the subway was, then reached in my backpack to retrieve my walkie-talkie. We always pack the small things, but powerful radios just in case. We never really had to use them before. But there's a first time for everything, right? So I got the radio out, switched on, and began talking on the agreed-upon channel 1. Our little pre-agreed protocol was that as soon as someone gets separated out from the radios, the guys must have figured that was missing by that point. So they must have had the radios out, or at least one of them. But when I talked him to the channel and got nothing in reply, I went back to thinking that they were just playing a prank on me. Then suddenly, my radio buzzes to life with an incoming transmission. It sounded kind of distorted. But that didn't surprise me, given that we were surrounded by masses of concrete. But as I'm straining my ears to listen to voices in the static, I realize it's not any of my buddies' voices. In fact, it sounded a lot more like a woman. It was slightly accented, a feminine voice, but I could only make out every fourth or fifth word. Everything else was just garbled. As I strained my ears and concentrated, I heard the voice repeating something that sounded an awful lot like "helped me." That was the first time I'd ever come to a full-on panic wallet and abandoned building. And I had to actually make an effort to control my breathing and keep calm. I told myself that the "help me" I thought I heard could have been almost any two-syllable phrase. And rationally speaking, the subway was a limited space. Even if I've managed to get myself lost, there was no way I could stay lost if I just kept moving. So it's exactly what I did. I switched on my little headlamp, told myself everything was going to be fine. Then just walked off into the darkness. My main goal was to find the station we'd been standing in. That way I could effectively retrace my steps and find my way out of the subway system. But I walked and walked for maybe 15 to 20 minutes, and the whole time I've failed to find an abandoned station or even any of the twin railway tunnels we've used to get into the place. It was just corridor after corridor, some of which forked off into 2 or 3 other passageways. And no matter which one I took, I never seemed to make any progress. I knew I could walk a mile and around 15 minutes, which meant that I could walk the entire length of the subway system and around 30 to 40. So when I clocked 45 minutes of walking, and I still hadn't found an exit, I felt myself getting that feeling of panic rising up into my chest again. Just didn't make any sense. The whole way I'd been talking to my radio, trying to raise my buddies, but to no avail. They had to be in range. Those radios were some of the most expensive things we owned. And the only reasonable explanation is the concrete was just too thick for the radio waves to penetrate. But still, even with a semi-rational explanation like that, I found one distinct thought creeping into my head. Something is very, very wrong here. Either something was wrong with me, or something was wrong with the tunnels, and being a somewhat rational person, I went with the first theory. I remember having to turn back when I wound up hitting a dead end. But after a few 100 feet, I realized I was walking a different layout of corridors than I had previously. Some of them had these cuboid concrete bumps in them, like they were the foundations for some kind of barrier. But then I started seeing them on the ceiling to these 3D rectangles that looked like they'd been chiseled out of the rock. I hadn't seen those things walking down the corridor the first time, at least, I hadn't noticed them. But then my suspicions were confirmed when I noticed the concrete ahead of me was all wet. Something which definitely hadn't been the case a few minutes before. That little detail did really bother me, way worse than losing my buddies too. As you can probably guess, underground tunnels and water leaks are a very bad combination. And the discovery added an even greater sense of danger to the situation. After I noticed the water, my pace increased significantly as I try my best to keep calm. But the further I went, the harder that got. The sound of my wet footsteps had me praying I wasn't heading towards the source of the leak, and that I wasn't about to hit by some underground tsunami or something. Not the most rational fear, I know. But like I said, I was struggling to remain calm. But then the tension was really ramping up. I could have sworn that I'd heard a second set of wet footsteps in the tunnel behind me. I remember stopping dead in my tracks and listening. But the sound didn't continue. So I figured it was just an echo of my own footsteps. It's shortly after continuing on my way, I heard a footstep behind me that was most definitely not in rhythm with my own. Again, I stop. Only that time I spent around on the spot, shining my flashlight into the darkness. I didn't see anything. And the sound of footsteps didn't continue. But I started to get this horrible feeling that there was something just out of range of my flashlight. That then queued up all these questions like who's down here without a flashlight and who might follow me and not announce themselves. The Cincinnati PD had been known to patrol the tunnels and kick out in the homeless trying to sleep there. And the urbex crowd tend to hate cops and security guards. But I found myself in this weird position where I actually hoped it was a cop that was following me and not someone else. I tried to just push on the turning around every so often when I thought I heard footsteps began to slow me down. And then I began to hit other obstacles. Those same cubes of concrete I'd seen previously, only they were much larger. Some of them were so big, I had to actually step up onto them to get past. It made no sense why they were there either. Like they only seemed to serve the purpose of constructing the tunnel. After another few 100 yards, the beam my flashlight began to illuminate something that just sent my stomach in knots. For absolutely no reason I could discern the tunnel abruptly narrowed to the point that there was only a very small vertical gap that I'd have to push myself a couple of feet through to keep going. I actually just stood there for a second and said out loud, "You have to be kidding me." The only other thing was the worry that the gap would somehow narrow even further and that I might get stuck trying to get through. But right as a molding that thawed over, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. Only that time there was no mistaking it. It couldn't have been the echo of my own. There was definitely someone else in a tunnel with me. I call out to them. You wishful thinking, I suppose. And when the speed of the footsteps dramatically increased, I knew their intentions toward me were not good. Fight or flight kicked in. And in the moment, I chose flight, shoving myself shoulder first into the narrow opening in the concrete before grinding my way through. The whole time, I expected to feel a hand grabbing on my back. And when I finally popped down to the other side, I spun around and shone my flashlight to see who in God's name was chasing me. But there was no one. I knew they were there though, hiding off just to the side, maybe just waiting for me to let my guard down before pushing through after me. Needless to say, I didn't wait to find out if I was right. I just took off along the wet concrete, trying to put as much distance between myself and my pursuer as possible. As I ran, I started to notice a lot more of those weird cuboid structures. Only this time, some of them were triangular, like little pyramids, coming out of the walls, floor, and ceiling. The others had at least looked like they served some kind of purpose. But these new things looked almost completely random. Like they were a glitch in the video game's levels for something. I'd have taken more time to observe them if I hadn't been running for my life. Only after a few 100 yards or so, the tunnel narrowed off yet again. Only that time, there was like nothing I've ever seen in my entire life. Now that I think back on it, it was like looking at a piece of tessellated art, like the kind that uses different sizes of the same shape to create a kind of 3D optical illusion. That would have been fascinating if I hadn't been forced to crawl through it on my stomach, not knowing if I was going to get trapped and starve to death in there. The whole lining of the passageway was rigged with tiny versions of the same pyramid structures. And it was so narrow that I had to take off my backpack and shove it in front of me in order to fit through the little ridges raked up my back the whole way. But my adrenaline was pumping so hard that I could feel the damage it was doing. It just didn't hurt. And then came the moment where I couldn't advance any further. I could feel the little ridges against my skull, neck, and shoulders. I couldn't push my backpack any further. And I was actually stuck. I was so scared. I felt sick. And I'm not ashamed to say, I felt the overwhelming urge to burst into tears. My mom had always told me that I eventually get myself hurt if I persisted with the trespassing nonsense. And in that moment, it seemed like she'd been proven right. Only the thing that made me want to burst into tears was the fact that she might never find out how right she was. I'd never be found because I knew I was somewhere I wouldn't be found just by looking for it. I know that must make no sense. But in that moment, trapped in the bizarre, intricately chiseled crawlspace, it made all the sense of the world. And just as it was sinking in just how screwed I really was, I heard something moving through the tunnels behind me. I'm not even sure how this really happened. Because as much as I tried to force my way through the crawlspace, I simply could not go any further. But hearing that person and what I'm assuming was a person moving up behind me, it just sent me into overdrive. I just kept focusing on kicking my legs, wiggling my torso, and pushing my backpack in front of me that I barely even realized I shoved it out the other side. Then once I could get a grip of the opening, I let out all the air in my lungs to be able to fit through and pulling with all my might. Filling myself free of the crawlspace concrete grip was the second time that night that I almost cried. But there was no time to celebrate. I had to keep moving only right when I needed it the most. Right when I thought it was about to lose my mind with fear. My flashlight started to flicker. I had replaced the batteries that night in preparation for exploring the subway. There was no way I could have been down there long enough to drain them. And I just lost it, consumed by panic. And I sprinted down the corridor, trying to make as much progress as possible before the flashlight gave out entirely. It started to flicker again. And I was running by actually started calling out Mom, like she could somehow save me from a nightmarish fate. Then I tripped and I hit the dirt hard. I felt the sting of the grazes on my forearms mixed with my sweat. And there was this dull ringing in my ear that I first figured was from being knocked unconscious. But the monotonous ringing wasn't anything my head. It was from a nearby highway. And when I opened my eyes, I saw I was back outside. I have absolutely no idea how I got back outside after tripping in the darkness. When I stopped ugly weeping into the dirt, I looked around for the entrance I'd fallen out of, but I couldn't see anything then read as I'm trying to work out what in God's name just happened to me. I feel my phone buzzing in my pocket as it reconnected to the cell network. And I won't bore you with the whole aftermath. I feel like this whole thing is just a massive wall of text already, but looks at my friends' faces on the ride back as I tried to explain what happened. Well, they put me off ever trying to properly explain it to someone. I went to therapy for a few years after a psychiatrist diagnosed me as having experienced a stress-induced psychotic break. I tried to accept that what happened was all just in my head. But honestly, I know that isn't entirely the case. And for some reason, whenever my mind wanders back to that night, I think of that giant black figure someone had spray painted on the wall. At the time, I had no idea why anyone would spend so much time on something that no one might ever see. But now, I think I understand.